A church falls silent, but one whisper hides a crime. Welcome to Mystery Parlour. I am your host, Axen. Share the intrigue. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your messages always brighten this journey. Now, into the story. Flaxborough, though nobody called it that aloud unless they were feeling literary or mildly annoyed, had reached that particular late spring calm when the town seemed to be holding its breath for no better reason than habit. The lilacs were out in the vicarage garden. The butcher's awning was newly scrubbed, and on the market square a man in a cap was putting up bunting for the Whit-week service with the slow precision of someone who knew his work would be noticed only if it went wrong. By 9:30 on Tuesday morning, everyone who wished to be seen wishing to be respectable was on some sort of route that passed St. Barnabas Church. The service, an ecumenical affair, civic and pious in equal measures, was scheduled for noon, which in Flaxborough meant that the real ceremony would begin 3 hours earlier in the form of polite drifting, deliberate greetings, and the careful exchange of information disguised as remarks about the weather. Mrs. Ada Blenkinsop, for instance, had set out to buy a loaf. She managed it eventually, but not before pausing at the railings to remark to Mrs. Bence that the vicar's roses do look a bit peaky this year, which was a charitable way of introducing the fact that Mrs. Bence's nephew had been seen leaving the vicarage at 7:30 on Sunday. Mrs. Bence, whose roses were never peaky and whose nephew was always misunderstood, replied that at least the town council had finally repaired that loose flagstone by the Lich Gate. Someone could have broken an ankle there, she said, which was a charitable way of introducing the fact that she had written 3 letters about it and would write 3 more if necessary. From the open iron gates of St. Barnabas, the church itself sat in its usual mild disapproval of modern life. A square-shouldered Victorian structure with a tower that looked like it had heard too much, it had lately acquired a new sound system and a small committee dedicated to discussing the sound system. It was also, inconveniently, still a church, and so attracted the sorts of people who thought God watched them more closely on Tuesdays. Inside, the verger, Mr. Cuffley, was polishing brass with the tenderness of a man dealing with something that could not answer back. The morning light came through the stained glass in colored puddles on the stone floor, making it look as though the saints had dropped sweet wrappers. At the front, the flowers were being arranged by Miss Letitia Vole, assistant librarian, amateur botanist, and a woman who could make a daffodil look as if it had apologized for existing. "Try those a touch higher, Miss Vole," called Councillor Hargreaves from the third pew, where he had lumbered in under the pretext of checking sight lines for the mayor. It was not a coincidence that the third pew gave him a full view of the chancel and a partial view of Miss Vole's left profile. Miss Vole did not look around. She raised the lilies precisely 1 inch. "They're quite high already, Councillor." "So they are," he said, magnanimous. "So they are. Always good to have a firm hand with these things." It was unclear whether he meant flower arrangements or the moral fibre of parish volunteers, but Miss Vole accepted the remark as she accepted everything else in Flaxborough, with a small nod, a private judgment, and no intention of arguing with the furniture. By 10 o'clock, the choir had begun to arrive. It was a modest gathering, 8 adults of varying commitment, and 1 boy whose voice had not yet decided whether it wished to be a tenor or a practical joke. Their choir master, Mr. Lionel Tuke, came last, sweeping in with the air of a man who had trained for the West End but had been thwarted by both fate and the bus timetable. He carried a leather folder of music that he treated with the kind of reverence normally reserved for wills. "Morning, morning," he murmured, nodding at Miss Vole, at Cuffley, at Councillor Hargreaves, at the church itself. On a good day, Mr. Tuke was genteel. On a bad day, he was genteel but injured. "Right," he said, clapping softly. "We'll run through the anthem once, just once. We don't want to tire ourselves before we've even had the sanctified sandwiches." That earned a ripple of dutiful laughter. Flaxborough people laughed as a social courtesy, the way others might tip a hat. The choir moved toward the vestry to gown up, leaving the nave quiet except for the scrape of Cuffley's cloth and the occasional sigh from Councillor Hargreaves, who had grown bored with not being addressed. At that moment, the side door clicked open with a sound that was entirely ordinary and, in retrospect, rather too ordinary. A young woman stepped in. She was not one of the choir, nor one of the flower committee, nor a town councillor on reconnaissance. She wore a navy coat that was one season too heavy for the morning and carried no bag. She did not remove her coat, which might have been a small breach of church etiquette, except that she seemed to regard etiquette as something that applied to other people's lives. Miss Vole, who had the marvellous instinct of someone accustomed to quiet rooms, turned. "Oh, hello." The young woman did not answer at once. She looked up toward the chancel, then left toward the pews, then back to Miss Vole as if deciding whether she could be bothered to speak. When she did, her voice was low and neatly done. "Is Reverend Puddick here?" "No, not yet. He's at the vicarage." Miss Vole set down a sprig of greenery that had done nothing to deserve being dropped. "Can I help?" The young woman's eyes flicked once to Councillor Hargreaves, who was watching openly now, as if expecting to be introduced. "I just need to leave something for him." Miss Vole paused. In Flaxborough, people rarely left things for the vicar without first explaining why, who they were, and whether it ought to be wrapped in tissue paper. "All right," she said gently. "What is it?" The young woman took one step forward and, from her coat pocket, produced a small envelope. Plain, unmarked. She held it out. Miss Vole did not take it immediately. There was nothing alarming in an envelope as such, but the way the young woman held it, pinched at one corner, suggested less a message than a mild hazard. "Shall I put it in his pigeonhole?" "Yes." The young woman's tone was almost indifferent. "Please." Miss Vole reached for it. Their fingers brushed fleetingly, the kind of contact that tells you useful things about another person's temperature and tension. The young woman's hand was cold. Miss Vole's, for all her composure, was damp. "May I ask who it's from?" Miss Vole said, politely enough to preserve the illusion that she was not asking. The young woman hesitated. It was a long enough hesitation to be a decision. "Tell him it's from a friend." "Of course." Miss Vole offered a smile that gathered no interest. The young woman turned away. She walked back toward the side door without pausing to look at the windows or the flower stands or anything else that people sometimes pretended to admire while waiting to be noticed. She walked as if she had done her bit and meant to get out before anyone asked her to do more. The door clicked shut behind her. Councillor Hargreaves cleared his throat in the particular way men did when they hoped to be asked a question. "Well," he said after a moment. Miss Vole, who had been staring at the envelope as if it might begin to speak, did not look up. Councillor Hargreaves leaned forward. "Strange girl." "Is she?" Miss Vole said carefully. "Not from round here. I know faces. Don't recall seeing her at any council functions or Women's Institute dues. Mind you, perhaps she's one of those newcomers in the old Vale cottage. Young people do move about, you know." Miss Vole's attention had drifted to the altar. The lilies, incongruously bright, suddenly looked like they had overheard something. "What's that you're holding?" Hargreaves asked, as if he did not already know. "A note for the vicar." "Oh?" A faint lift in his brow. "Ah, nothing to do with the service, I hope. We don't want any last-minute upset. Puddick gets flustered." Miss Vole kept her tone mild. "It's sealed." "As notes often are." He waited, then added, "From whom?" She didn't say. A short silence came down between them, not hostile, but full of the density gossip requires to begin. Miss Vole moved briskly toward the vestry, envelope in hand. She told herself it was nothing, a parishioner with a private matter, perhaps, or a stranger asking for help. Still, her mind teased at the word friend the way a loose thread troubles a neat sleeve. It was an odd choice. Flaxborough people were friends by default until they weren't, and even then they called each other a Mrs. or counsellor to avoid admitting it. She placed the envelope in the vicar's worn oak pigeonhole. It sat there with innocent plainness, more conspicuous for being unremarkable. When she returned to the nave, Cuffley had paused polishing and was looking toward the side door. "Did you know her?" he asked quietly. "No." He resumed the brass with renewed vigor. "She looked as though she didn't want to be seen." Miss Vole considered. "Perhaps she didn't." Cuffley sniffed. "Then she picked the wrong town." Miss Vole went back to the flowers. Councillor Hargreaves, deprived of an audience, wandered off to inspect the new microphone stand, muttering about wires in sacred places. The choir's muffled chatter and gown rustle came from the vestry. The morning light shifted discreetly along the aisle, and in the vicar's pigeonhole, beneath the little wooden label that read Rev. J. Puddick, the envelope waited. It waited in the quiet of an ordinary Tuesday, for a service that had not yet begun, and for a truth that Flaxborough had not yet learned it would need. Reverend Puddick arrived at St. Barnabas by 10:15, breathing a little harder than his walk required. He entered, found the verger, and accepted 3 pieces of information at once. The microphone still hissed, the mayor wanted a special prayer, and a note had been left in his pigeonhole. "A note?" he repeated. Mr. Cuffley pointed with his cloth. "There, Vicar. Miss Vole put it in. Young woman brought it." Puddick crossed to the pigeonholes, looked at the blank envelope, and lifted it out. He told himself it would be a request about a funeral or a hymn. Then he opened it. The paper inside was short, written in block capitals. "Bring the silver communion chalice to the charity box outside Flaxborough station at 9 tonight. Come alone. If you speak of this, you will regret it. No signature, no explanation." He read it twice. The first time he thought it must be a prank. The second time he recalled the young woman's odd, hurried manner. A tremor moved through his right hand. He folded the note and slid it into his pocket. Behind him the choir were emerging from the vestry, and Councillor Hargreaves was hovering like a bird waiting for crumbs. "Everything all right, Vicar?" Hargreaves asked. "Quite, just a parish matter. Excuse me." He retreated to the vestry and closed the door. The room was dim and smelled of damp wool. He tried to think sensibly. The chalice had been given in 1873 by a brewer's widow and was routinely admired by older ladies as something decent that had outlasted men. It was valuable and consecrated. Either fact might tempt a thief, though neither should have mattered in a town that liked to believe itself safe. He read the note again. The threat was vague enough to let his conscience invent its own horrors. He had no sin that would justify blackmail, yet he knew Flaxborough could call anything a scandal if it were bored. "You will regret it" could mean gossip, broken windows, or something worse. There was a knock. "Vicar?" Miss Vole's voice. He opened the door a fraction. "Is the note about the service?" she asked softly. "No, thank you, Miss Vole. Merely a request for a private talk." He forced a smile. "She said she was a friend?" "Yes. She asked for you and wouldn't say more." "Did you recognize her?" "No, Vicar. Not from town." "Indeed." He shut the door, steadied himself, and went out to conduct a service as if nothing had happened. The Whitweek service passed off well enough. The mayor's chain blinked in the sunlight. Mr. Tuke drove the anthem to a finish that woke the sleepy. Puddick preached about quiet stewardship, a sermon that sounded harmless to everyone except himself. Afterwards, there was tea in the parish hall. Puddick listened to complaints, rearranged 2 rotas, and laughed in the right places, while the note in his pocket grew heavier. Twice he caught Councillor Hargreaves watching him with the satisfaction of a man who knew something was going on. When the hall began to empty, Miss Vole stayed behind to fold tablecloths. Puddick crossed to her and lowered his voice. "If that young woman should return, would you ask her to call at the vicarage?" Miss Vole looked up. "Is there trouble?" Only confusion. I should like to clear it up. Of course. He walked home with the careful steps of someone on thin ice. The town outside resumed its weekday rhythm, and every nod from a neighbor felt like a question he could not answer. At 7 that evening he unlocked the church safe. The chalice lay in its velvet cradle, a squat gleam of silver that had seen more contrition than crime. He carried it back to the vicarage in his satchel, telling Mrs. Gaskell he was checking inventory. She said nothing. In his study, he wrapped the chalice in brown paper and tied it with string. He set the parcel on the desk beside the note and stared at both, weighing obedience against sense. The clock seemed to tick louder as 9 approached. At 8:45, unable to bear the secrecy, he telephoned Inspector Purbright. The station was quiet. Purbright answered on the second ring. Purbright. Inspector, it's Puddick. I'm sorry to ring so late. I've had a disturbing message. Tell me about it, Reverend. Puddick read the note aloud, glancing at the window as though the writer might be listening. When he finished, there was a pause that felt like a hand held up for silence. And you were instructed not to speak of it, Purbright said. Yes. Are you alone? Yes. Only my housekeeper downstairs. Good. Stay where you are. I'll come over. But the note says, I know what it says. Purbright's tone was polite and therefore firm. It also says to bring the chalice, and I'd prefer the chalice stayed in your sight. Puddick found he could not argue. All right. Purbright arrived 10 minutes later in a raincoat buttoned 1 notch wrong, not from haste, but from habit. He listened while Puddick repeated the whole matter. Purbright did not interrupt. When Puddick finished, he took the note, held it near the lamp, and read it carefully. Block capitals, he said. Deliberate. Not especially polished. Do you think it's a joke? A joke wants an audience. This wants obedience. Purbright glanced at the parcel. So no. Outside, a car passed slowly, tires whispering on wet cobbles, and both men heard it distinctly. He pocketed the note. Tell me about the young woman who brought it. I never saw her. Then we'll find someone who did. He looked up. I'll need a word with your verger and Miss Vole, and I'd like the chalice kept here until we know what we're dealing with. Puddick nodded, still ashamed of his fear, still grateful for company. What should I do now? Make some tea, Purbright said. Strong. We may be up late. Puddick made tea because it was the only action left that still felt tidy. He carried the tray into the study and watched Purbright stir sugar as if it were an experiment. The inspector drank, thanked him, and began asking questions in the same mild voice he used for parish fetes and murders alike. Who had keys to the church safe? Had anyone been alone in the vestry that morning? Did the vicar often walk about with the chalice? Puddick answered carefully, and heard how thin reassurance sounded when spoken aloud. Any dispute lately? Purbright asked. Anything that might make the chalice useful to someone besides the altar? None. I disappoint people in small ways, but no one has threatened me. Purbright wrote a line in his notebook. Threats don't always rise from disputes. Sometimes they rise from opportunity. Mrs. Gaskell knocked and entered without waiting. She was brisk, capable, and quietly delighted by unexpected company. Sandwiches are in the kitchen if you want them. Is there trouble? Nothing you need attend to, Purbright said. We're clarifying a minor matter. She noticed the brown parcel on the desk and decided not to notice it. Very good, she said, and withdrew. When her steps faded, Purbright glanced at his watch. You were meant to be at the station charity box at 9. If we do nothing, whoever wrote this will be disappointed. People who go to trouble dislike that. We'll let them think we tried. You mean go? Puddick said a little faintly. Not you, not alone. Purbright stood. I'll send officers to watch and I'll go myself. The chalice stays here. But the note, I know what it says. His tone remained courteous, which in Purbright was a kind of wall. If you already regret something, it may not be from disobedience. He used the hall telephone and spoke to the station with quiet efficiency. Sergeant Lovejoy to the charity box. Constable Ingram to the goods yard lane. Keep out of sight and no noise unless needed. He slipped the note into his pocket and put on his hat. Reverend, do something that will look dull, he said. Go upstairs, lights out at a sensible hour. If someone is watching, let them see routine. If anyone comes to the door, don't open it. Ring us. Puddock nodded because it was easier than thinking. Purbright left by the back, coat collar up against a drizzle that had begun to turn the evening soft and colourless. Flaxborough at night was not menacing so much as private. Windows glowed behind curtains drawn with the air of keeping opinions to themselves. Purbright walked to the station without hurry. Rain helped. It thinned the streets and made footprints honest. The forecourt was nearly empty. The charity box stood under a lamp by the booking office door, a red iron pillar with a slot used for Whitweek donations and abandoned pennies. Lovejoy was already there, pretending to read the timetable. He was square, red-faced, and happier outdoors than in reasoning. No sign yet, sir, he murmured. Let's keep it that way a moment, Purbright said. He took position by the newspaper stand. From there he could see the box, the low wall behind it, and the narrow lane to the goods yard. The last train had gone. Only a faint hum from the town remained. 9 o'clock came. At 9:03 a man in a cap ambled in from the road, hands deep in pockets, doing his best imitation of someone killing time. He slowed by the box, glanced about, and hesitated. Hesitation was confession in miniature. He peered at the slot as if expecting silver to rise out of it unaided. Purbright watched his mouth murmur a curse when a match failed in the wind. Then a second figure emerged from the goods yard lane, shorter, coat collar up. The two met beside the box. The shorter one spoke quickly. The taller replied with an impatient flick of his hand. Neither tone suggested surprise. Both looked, almost together, toward the booking office and the road. Purbright waited until he saw their expectation turn to irritation. He said softly, "Now." Lovejoy stepped into the light. "Evening." Both men froze. The tall one swung round too fast. He had already decided that running might be useful. The shorter one merely bent his knees a fraction, ready. "Police," Lovejoy added, enjoying the syllables. "What's this about?" the tall man snapped. Purbright walked up, rain beading on his hat brim. "We were wondering that too. You've been waiting for someone. For a train. The next train is at 6:40 tomorrow." Purbright's voice stayed mild. "That's a long wait. Your names?" The shorter man bolted without choosing a direction, only a hope. He ran for the lane. Lovejoy went after him, heavy but fast, swearing with professional affection. The tall man started to follow, thought better of it, then tried dignity. "I haven't done anything." "Perhaps not yet," Purbright said. "But you came expecting to. Let's talk somewhere drier." The man searched Purbright's face for uncertainty, found none, and slowly nodded. "All right." Purbright guided him toward the booking office. Behind them there was a shout, a scuffle, and Lovejoy's triumphant grunt. The shorter man was dragged back into the lamplight, hat lost, collar down. His face was young, pale, and furious rather than frightened. Purbright looked at him and felt a small click of recognition, not a conclusion, just the beginning of one. He had seen this lad in daylight doing something ordinary, and the memory hovered just out of reach. Constable Ingram appeared from the shadows by the parcels office, breathing hard but pleased to have been useful. He nodded to Purbright, then kept hold of the younger man's elbow as if it were a parcel likely to slip. The tall one swallowed and stared at the ground. "Gentlemen," Purbright said, "I think you'd better tell me why you expected a communion chalice to turn up in a charity box." Purbright did not raise his voice, because raised voices made people look for exits. He simply waited, hands in his coat pockets, while the 3 policemen and 2 damp suspects stood under the station awning. Rain ticked on the corrugated roof, and the charity box, red and stolid beneath its lamp, looked absurdly innocent. The taller man cleared his throat. "I was told to meet someone," he said. "That's all. Nothing about any chalice." "You were told to meet a vicar," Purbright replied. The man blinked. "No, I wasn't." "Then you've wandered into a coincidence so neat it deserves a plaque." Purbright examined him leisurely. Late 40s, large-boned, a face that had spent years outdoors and learned not to apologize for it. A cap worn into shape by habit. "Your name?" "Sidney Marr." "Sid." "Ingram, would you take Mr. Marr into the booking hall and note his particulars?" Ingram nodded and guided Marr away. Marr went without protest, but his shoulders held a defensive stiffness that did not belong to the entirely innocent. Purbright turned to the younger one. He was shaking rain from his hair, angry at the weather as if it had singled him out. His grey-green eyes were familiar now that Purbright let them be. He had seen them that morning in St. Barnabas, above a surplice collar, trying to look bored while watching Miss Vole set flowers. Tom Spendlove, printer's apprentice, the choir boy whose voice had not yet chosen a side. "Thomas," Purbright said, "stop hopping about, or Sergeant Lovejoy will stop you for you." "I haven't done anything," Tom burst out. "You can't—" "Tom," Lovejoy grunted, "you legged it. That's something." Tom glared, tested his outrage against Purbright's mildness, and found it slid off. "All right," he said at last. "We were waiting for a parcel. Sid said it was a job. I didn't know it was church stuff." "Sid said it was a job," Purbright repeated. "Who offered it?" "A woman." "Describe her." "Dark hair, smart coat, not from round here." The words hurried out now. "She came to the press last week, asked for Sid. Said she'd heard he was reliable. She told him she wanted something collected. Said it was silver and worth a bit. She paid half up front." "Did she mention a vicar?" "No. She said someone would come at 9 and drop it in the box, and we were to wait till he'd gone and take it. Sid said the slot was big enough. I didn't ask." "You did not ask why a stranger used a charity box as a handover." "She said people don't notice boxes, and Sid said it was no worse than lifting scrap." Tom's chin lifted in a show of toughness that came out thin. "Look, I didn't write any note, and I never went near the safe. I was singing hymns this morning." "I know. Your anthem was slightly ahead of Mr. Tuke's beat in the second verse," Purbright said, and watched surprise crack the boy's face. "Why did you agree to come?" Tom flushed. "Because I need cash. My dad's slow with money lately. Press is quiet. Mum's on at me. I thought it was a bit of silver from a house, not a blooming chalice." Purbright nodded. "Anything else about her? Voice, smell, jewelry?" Tom hesitated, then muttered, "She smelt like cloves, those strong cigarettes, and she had a ring. Big green stone, that's all." Purbright nodded again. "Lovejoy, take Tom in. Keep him apart from Ma. If he remembers more, you'll tell me." Lovejoy marched the boy away. When they'd gone, Purbright lingered a moment under the awning. Woman, navy coat, clove smoke, green stone. Not much, yet it fitted too neatly with the young woman who had delivered the note to Miss Vole. It also fitted anyone who fancied herself interesting. He went into the booking hall. Ingram was finishing Mar's details. Ma sat on a bench, cap in his hands, looking smaller without the boy beside him. "Mr. Marr," Purbright said, settling opposite, "you have a reputation for doing favors after hours. Some legal, some not." Ma sighed. "You lot never let a man grow old." "Some men grow old by choosing their jobs carefully. I didn't know it was church silver." Ma looked genuinely injured by the idea. She never said. Just said there'd be a parcel and there was money. "I'm not proud, Inspector, but I'm not robbing vicars." "Not deliberately." "Tell me about her. She's well-spoken, not posh, but educated. Came to my shed by the allotments, knew my name. Said someone in the pub told her about me. He rubbed a thumb over his stubble. Said she'd had trouble. That someone was hiding things from her and she wanted her property back. I told her if it was hers she could go to the police. She laughed, like I'd said something sweet. Did she show you proof? No. Just paid half up front in new notes and told me to meet here at 9. Leave as soon as we had it. Purbright let the silence sit, then stood. You'll stay here tonight, Mr. Marr. We're not charging you yet, but we aren't trusting you either. Marr's shoulders dropped in defeated relief. Purbright stepped back outside into the rain and started for the vicarage. The streets were empty in that careful Flaxborough way, as if every house had agreed to keep its curtains shut until an entirely respectable hour. Purbright walked without hurrying, letting the damp air cool the heat of the chase. 2 men could be hired for scraps of silver. Hiring them for a chalice meant either miscalculation or contempt for the town's habits. If the woman expected the chalice in the box, she must have believed the vicar would comply. She had threatened him before knowing whether the threat would work. That suggested either intimate knowledge of Reverend Puddick's nerves, or that the note was only the second move in a game already underway. When Purbright returned to the vicarage, it was near 11, and the rain had settled into that steady moral drizzle that made Flaxborough feel as if it were being watched by a disappointed aunt. The front door opened at his knock almost at once. Puddick must have been standing behind it listening for trouble like a man waiting to hear his own sentence. "You're all right," Purbright said before the vicar could ask. "And so is the chalice." Puddick let out a breath that seemed to unbutton him. Thank God. What happened? Purbright stepped into the hall, the smell of beeswax and old hymn books greeting him. He took off his hat, shook it gently, and spoke as if describing a mild traffic incident. 2 men were waiting by the charity box. They expected a parcel at 9. Neither knew it came from you. One is a local odd-job man named Sidney Marr. The other is Thomas Spendlove, your tenor who runs before the beat. Puddick blinked. Tom? But he's only a boy. Boys grow into men by doing foolish things for cash, Purbright said. These 2 were hired by a woman. Dark hair, accent not local, clove cigarettes, a ring with a green stone. Does that remind you of anyone? Puddick sat heavily on the hall chair. No one at all. I can't imagine who would want the chalice. Nor can I yet. Purbright glanced toward the study. May I see it again? Puddick led him through. The parcel lay on the desk where they had left it, austere and patient. Purbright unwrapped it with the care of a man who knew reverence could coexist with evidence. The silver caught the lamplight and threw it back coldly. Have you had any visitors this week besides parish business? Purbright asked. Only the usual. A marriage enquiry, a mother wanting school references. I've done nothing out of the ordinary. That does not always prevent being interesting to others. Purbright ran a finger along the base. Any inscription besides the dedication? Puddick peered. Not that I know. Purbright found it anyway. A faint maker's mark, and just beneath, a small line of engraving barely visible unless you bent close. He read it silently, then spoke it aloud. EHS 1902. That's not part of the original dedication. Puddick frowned. I've never noticed that. The chalice has been in the safe since I came. Why would there be another engraving? Perhaps because it meant something to someone once, Purbright said. Do we have parish records, donation books, minutes? Yes, in the church office. We'll look tomorrow. For now, I'd like to take this to the station and keep it secure. Puddick hesitated, then nodded. Of course. If it's safer. The safe was not the weak point, Purbright said gently. You were. But you've improved. The vicar half smiled and then looked ashamed to be comforted by a line that was not quite a compliment. Purbright wrapped the chalice again, took the parcel under his arm, and moved to go. On the hall table he paused at a row of photographs. Puddock with church groups, with the mayor, with a brownie pack, with the choir at Christmas. The faces in them were ordinary, content, and faintly smug in the way people are when the present is not yet trouble. "Reverend," he said, "about the note. Did you recognize the handwriting?" "No," Puddock said quickly. "It was block capitals. Block capitals still have habits. Pressure, slant, spacing. Did it feel male or female?" Puddock looked startled. How could I tell?" "Sometimes you can't, but sometimes you can by the things the writer assumes. If you speak of this, you will regret it. That's a threat that expects shame to do part of the work. Shame is a more female weapon in a town like this. Men tend to promise damage. Women promise exposure." Puddock opened his mouth in protest, then shut it. He had spent long years hearing men and women in sorrow and knew the inspector wasn't entirely wrong. He simply didn't like hearing it put so plainly. "Still," Purbright added, "a man who thinks like a woman could write the same line. We won't jump." He left the vicarage, parcel in hand, and drove to the station. Lovejoy had already locked Ma away in the single holding room and put Tom in the interview office with a custard cream and a lecture. Purbright placed the chalice in evidence, and then, because it was too late for anything except small things that matter, he sat at his desk and read the note again. The paper was cheap, torn from a pad you might buy in Austin's. The pencil was hard. The capitals were compact, slightly leaning right, with a tendency to press heavier at the start of each line. Whoever wrote it was controlled, possibly angry, and in a hurry to look controlled. The spelling was correct. That eliminated half the town and matched the other half. He made a call to Dr. Vickers, the pathologist, not because there was a body, but because Vickers liked puzzles. Vickers answered sleepily, was offended that no one was dead, and then brightened slightly at the chance to be useful without gloves. "Bring it in tomorrow," he said. "I'll tell you if it was written by someone with a nervous system." Purbright thanked him and put the phone down, aware that he'd thanked him in the same tone as if he were arranging a fishing trip. At 11:30, he went into the interview office. Tom sat with shoulders hunched, a boy trying to look older in the wrong circumstances. Lovejoy had taken his cap off him and put it on the table like a stern teacher placing confiscated property beyond reach. Tom looked up. "Inspector, I've told them everything." "Usually there is more even after everything," Purbright said, taking a chair. "Where did she meet you?" "The press yard, by the loading bay." "Did she call you by name?" "No, sir. She asked if Sid was about. I came out because I heard her voice. She looked me over like I was a tool." "How did that make you feel?" Tom stared. "Like I should prove I wasn't. People who feel that way are easy to hire." Purbright said it mildly, not to wound him, but to lodge it somewhere he might remember later. "Did she know the church well enough to name the chalice?" Tom shook his head. "She didn't say chalice. She said silver cup from the church. Like she knew it was there." "Did she say why she wanted it?" "She said someone had taken what was hers. She said, 'I'm not letting them keep it out of spite.'" Tom swallowed. She looked proper cross, but not loud. "Did she mention any other person? A husband, brother, partner?" "No." Tom rubbed his hands on his knees. "She said it was between her and him, that's all." Purbright nodded, filed the phrase away, and stood. "You'll go home in the morning. I suggest you sing your hymns as if you mean them." Tom looked at him miserably. "Am I in real trouble?" "You were in trouble the moment you ran," Purbright said. "Now you're a witness. Be a better one than you were a thief." He left Tom to his custard cream and walked down the corridor to Ma. Ma sat on the bench inside the cell, staring at his boots like a man checking whether they'd betrayed him. "Mr. Ma," Purbright said, You've done jobs for people before? Any of them smoke cloves? Ma snorted. Not unless they were foreign. Those things stink. Green-stoned ring? He thought. Maybe. I didn't look close. She kept her hands in her pockets most of the time. What did she pay you with? New fivers. Crisp, like they'd been ironed. Did she arrive by car? On foot. From the allotment lane. That lane joins the ring road. She could have walked from anywhere. Purbright nodded. All right. Sleep if you can. He went back to his desk, wrote a few lines, and then sat for a long time doing nothing that looked like work. The woman believed the chalice was hers, or believed she could say so convincingly to men who didn't ask questions. She knew enough about St. Barnabas to name what she wanted, and enough about Purbright to frighten him. She also set a handover that minimized exposure. A public place, a box no one watched, 2 hired collectors. She did not intend to be seen, which meant, Purbright thought, that she probably lived close enough to risk being recognized. Morning came with as little drama as Flaxborough ever allowed itself. The rain had rinsed the streets into a shy brightness, and in the market square a lorry delivered crates of lettuces as if that were the only news the town required. By 8 o'clock, Purbright was in his office, with a mug of tea poured by someone else, and forgiven for it. He began at St. Barnabas. Purbright met him at the side door looking as though he'd slept in short installments. Inside, the church had returned to its weekday air of mild neglect. Cold stone, hymnals, brass dim again, flowers drooping politely. Miss Vole was in the vestry filing hymn sheets, because she was the sort who tidied when unsettled. Miss Vole, Purbright said, tell me again about the woman who left the note. Miss Vole obliged. Young, dark hair, navy coat, no bag, no smile. She had an accent. Not strong. South, perhaps. With something else in it. Something else? A flattening on certain vowels. You hear it with people who've moved about. Purbright thanked her and turned to Cuffley, who had appeared with his cloth and the mild grievance of being useful too early. Cuffley had more to say. He had seen the woman's profile as she left, had noticed the clove smell, and had noticed, because vergers notice everything that might later be relevant to their own vindication, that she had not come from the main street but from the path along the churchyard wall. She knew the side door, he said. Most strangers don't. Purbright made a note. People learned side doors either by living near them or by being shown. He asked after keys to the safe. Cuffley listed 3 holders, the vicar himself, and the churchwarden, Mrs. Edna Terence, who kept hers in a biscuit tin. The safe had not been opened since Easter, except for Purbright's inventory check last night. Anyone asked to see the plate lately? Purbright asked. No, sir. Not since Heritage Day in autumn, Cuffley said. Heritage Day, Purbright murmured, as if the word had grown teeth. Mrs. Terence had everyone in the chancel poking about. Everyone? The mayor, Councillor Hargreaves, half the Women's Guild, a photographer from the Gazette. It was very proper. Proper occasions were excellent for improper observation. Purbright asked for the donation book. Purbright produced a leather ledger that smelt of ink and duty. The chalice entry was easy to find. Gift of Mrs. Lillian Harbottle, widow, 1873. Under it, in a different hand, another note. Repairs undertaken by EHS, silversmith, in memory of his wife, Margaret S. No more, but enough to confirm the faint engraving. Why would someone think that gave them ownership? Purbright asked. Memorial gifts breed entitlement, Purbright said. He copied the detail, then shut the book. They walked to the museum. It was always too warm, as if the curator believed heat could stop time. Mrs. Ada Blenkinsop was on duty, cardigan furred with lint, eyes bright at the sight of a policeman. Oh, Inspector, has something happened to the Norman brooch? Not the brooch, Purbright said. We'd like the EHS silver and any family records. She led them to a glass case. The spoons gleamed like polite ghosts. She fetched a file. Edmund Henry Scarrow, she recited. Silversmith, Bell Lane, died 1931. Wife Margaret, née Simmons, died 1902. No children. One nephew, Stephen, moved to Nottingham. Line rather dwindled. Any relations in town now? Purbright asked. Not direct, no. But there was a Scarrow girl at school with my Ernie. Through the nephew. Married a Mr. Rook from the Vale Cottages. Divorced him noisily. Went to London. Came back last summer for old Mrs. Rook's funeral. Talk she'd take a cottage. First name? Puddock asked. Eleanor. Ellie. Pretty thing. Too clever for her own happiness. Purbright felt the pieces settle without clicking into place. Eleanor Scarrow, ES under EHS, the green ring, the educated voice, the not-quite-local accent. A woman returning to a town that remembered her youth and would never let her grow out of it. He thanked Mrs. Blenkinsop, who was already composing her version of the morning, and walked back with Puddock in companionable silence. "Do you know her?" Purbright asked. "I remember her as a girl," Puddock said. "She sang in the choir once. Bright, restless. I haven't seen her in years. Perhaps she's seen you." At the station, Purbright found Tom ready to go home, pale but relieved, and Ma subdued. He released Ma with a warning and kept Tom as a witness on paper. Then he sent Lovejoy to Bell Lane to speak to the Rooks and neighbours, and drove to the Vale Cottages himself. They sat behind overgrown hawthorns, once genteel, now resigned. Cottage number 3 had fresh curtains and a clean path, which suggested either recent move-in or a person who enjoyed beginning again. Purbright knocked. A woman's voice called, "Just a moment," not flustered, merely delayed. Eleanor Scarrow opened the door. Early 30s, slender, dark hair, pinned carelessly, navy cardigan over a blouse that had seen better cities. Her right hand rested on the door edge, and on it was a ring with a large green stone. She looked from Purbright's face to his hatband and back. "Inspector Purbright," she said, as if she had rehearsed the name. I wondered how long it would take. She stepped back to let him in, not quite hospitable, not defiant. The cottage smelled of fresh paint and something citrusy trying too hard. Boxes were stacked neatly by the stairs, labelled in a careful hand. A single photograph sat on the mantel, face down, as if it had been put there temporarily or in a hurry. Eleanor watched him take these things in and seemed faintly amused that he did so without comment. Her eyes were steady. Whatever she expected, it wasn't surprise. Her calmness was not innocence. It was armor. Purbright smiled faintly. "Good morning, Miss Scarrow. May we come in and wonder together?" Eleanor led them into the sitting room. The room was narrow, tidier than it had any right to be given the stacked boxes, and furnished with a deliberate plainness. A kettle hissed in the kitchen. Puddock, behind Purbright, looked as though he would have preferred a lion in a vestry to a clever woman in a cottage. "Tea?" Eleanor asked, already moving. She went to the kitchen, leaving the two men among clean surfaces and citrus floor polish. Purbright sat, hat on his knee, letting silence do its quiet probing. Puddock perched upright, hands folded as if practicing for a confession. Eleanor returned with a tray and poured briskly. She set a cup for each man and sat opposite, legs crossed, hands loose in her lap, ring flashing green. "You've come about the chalice," she said. Purbright nodded. "I have. And you've picked up 2 men at the station for expecting it." "Questioned," he corrected mildly. "They were hired by you." She gave a small, offended breath. "Yes. I didn't intend to stand by a charity box myself. I'm not a criminal by temperament, Inspector. I'm merely tired." "Tired of what?" "Of being done out of what belongs to me, of being treated as a visitor to my own family." Puddock shifted. "Eleanor, if there's been a misunderstanding..." It's not a misunderstanding, Reverend. You may not know the history. Purbright said, "Tell me as you understand it." My great-great-uncle, Edmund Scarrow, repaired that chalice in 1902 in memory of his wife, Margaret. Their names are on the base. He wrote to the vicar asking that if the church ever stopped using the chalice, it should return to the Scarrow line. The vicar agreed. There's a signed copy upstairs. You believe that agreement binds the church now? I believe it binds anyone who respects a promise. When I came back for Mrs. Rook's funeral, I asked Mrs. Terence if we could borrow the chalice for a family memorial. One evening, she said it was parish property and that my family's engraving was sentimental decoration. That's what people say when they want to know your place. And you decided to take it. I decided to reclaim it, not to sell, to keep. Margaret Scarrow's name is there because her husband wanted it remembered. I'm the only one left who cares. If the church can't acknowledge the family, why should it keep the object? You didn't ask me, Puddick said quietly. I did. By letter last month. It went unanswered. Puddick blinked. I never saw it. Mrs. Gaskell handles the post. She may have assumed it was circular. Convenient, Eleanor said. You see what I mean. Purbright asked, why the threat to Reverend Puddick? Her composure tightened. Because I was afraid he'd do what everyone here does when you ask politely. Tell the whole town. Then I'd have committees explaining why I was making a fuss. I wanted it done quickly. Quickly enough to frighten the vicar and involve two men who didn't ask questions. Yes, she spread her hands. I tried letters, conversation, being nice. None of it works here unless you already belong in the center. Purbright sipped his tea. Threatened theft is still theft by intention. She laughed once. So I'm a thief because I won't leave my family's name in a safe for committees to admire once a year. Not because of your feeling, Purbright said, because of your method. Her gaze sharpened. Method is all a town like this cares about. People do cruel things as long as they do them politely. I thought I might as well learn the language. Puddick looked pained. Eleanor, I'm sorry you felt dismissed. Had I known... You didn't want to know, she said, not unkindly, but final. Purbright set his cup down. You mentioned an agreement. I need to see it. Of course. She went upstairs. They heard a box slide, paper rustle. Puddick stared at his tea, as if prayer had become a practical problem. She returned with a ribboned bundle of letters. Purbright read slowly. The paper was old and honest. The handwriting matched what the museum kept. The key line was plain. Should the chalice fall from liturgical use, it was to be returned to the Scarrow family, in memory of Margaret's devotion. He folded the letters and handed them back. These are persuasive, but they do not give you the right to remove the chalice while it is still in use. In use? She snapped. Once a month when someone remembers the key? It spends its life locked away because Mrs. Terence prefers her modern set. That may be arguable, Purbright said, but it isn't for you to decide by stealth. She sat again, shoulders dropping. So what happens now? You charge me. Put my name in the Gazette? Not if you cooperate. We'll discuss this with the church wardens and the diocesan solicitor. If you have a claim, we will handle it properly. Properly, she repeated. In other words, slowly. Slowly avoids charity boxes at night, Purbright said. She exhaled. All right, I'll do it your way. I don't want to hurt anyone. I only want not to be ignored. Purbright stood. Then don't be. Come to the station this afternoon with these documents. We'll take a statement. Until then, I'll keep the chalice safe. Eleanor nodded, but her eyes narrowed slightly at keep. Purbright noticed. When people agree quickly, they keep one pocket closed. On the doorstep, she said, I didn't come to cause scandal. I came because this town is a museum that still thinks it's alive. I wanted one thing inside it that was mine. Purbright met her gaze. Museums are full of things people feel that way about. We'll see what the law says and what the living say after it." He left with Puddock. They walked down the lane, hedges dripping, air smelling of wet earth and lilac. Behind them, the cottage door shut softly, as if on a decision not yet finished. Purbright and Puddock returned to the main road without speaking for a while. The vicar's face had the strained courtesy of a man watching a familiar parishioner turn into a problem. Purbright let him keep the silence. Vicars, like kettles, often came to a boil more safely when left to themselves. At Bell Lane, they parted. Puddock went back to his church with a promise to speak to Mrs. Tarrant before lunchtime. Purbright drove to the station, thinking not about Eleanor's grievance, which was, in its way, reasonable, but about the neatness with which she had arrived at crime after failing to arrive at a notice. People who made that journey quickly could make it again. He found Lovejoy waiting in the corridor. "Any trouble?" Purbright asked. "Only the Gazette sniffing about last night," Lovejoy said. "Hargreaves was at the door before 9. Swore he'd heard shouting at the station." "Councillor Hargreaves has a developed ear for excitement," Purbright murmured. "I'll speak to him later." On the desk lay a note from Constable Ingram. A call had come in at 7:45 from Mrs. Rook, Eleanor's former mother-in-law, wanting to know why police had been at the station. "She says she saw Ellie Scarrow heading to Vale Cottages yesterday afternoon and thinks she's up to something," Ingram had written. At 11, the telephone rang. It was Mrs. Tarrant, and indignation had made her forget greetings. "Inspector, I've just spoken to Reverend Puddock. He says the chalice is in police custody because of some female upset. I want it back, at once. The church does not answer to your station." "Good morning to you too, Mrs. Tarrant," Purbright said. "The chalice is safe. We'll return it when the matter is clarified." "There is nothing to clarify. That girl has no right. She was a rook for 5 minutes and made it miserable. Now she's come back to make trouble for the rest of us. Let's speak in person. Come to the station at 1. She huffed agreement and rang off. Just before noon, Lovejoy brought Tom Spendlove's mother to the desk. Mrs. Spendlove was small and wiry. She apologized for her son, demanded his release, then burst into tears because apology and demand were hard to carry together. Purbright sent her home with Tom and a lecture she would repeat verbatim. After they'd gone, Lovejoy said, "So that's that then. She wanted her family cup. We tell her, ask nice, and everyone goes home?" Purbright looked up. If only crimes were that cooperative. "She wanted the chalice. Yes. She planned it, yes. But she also believed the vicar would comply, and she believed no one would see her. Those beliefs came from somewhere. I'm not sure where." Lovejoy frowned. "She's just stubborn." "Perhaps. But stubborn people don't usually hire Ma and a choir boy without being shown the path to them. She found Ma by name. She knew the side door at St. Barnabas. She knew the safe existed. Those are small pieces of knowledge. Small pieces often belong to someone who lives close to a place." At 1 o'clock sharp, Mrs. Tarrant arrived in a hat that looked like a battle flag. She sat opposite Purbright and arranged her handbag in front of her, as if it were a witness. "We've kept that chalice with care for a century," she began. "Insured it, polished it, preserved it. If the Scarrow line wanted it, they should have asked before they let the line dwindle to one bad-tempered divorcee. Eleanor Scarrow has produced letters suggesting a contingent return. Letters mean nothing if the church still uses the object. It's in use, isn't it? Your new set has been used for years, I'm told." Mrs. Tarrant sniffed. "Modern plate is lighter, safer for elderly communicants, and looks presentable. The old chalice is for special occasions." "Such as Heritage Day." "Exactly. The town likes to see its history." "And was Eleanor there on Heritage Day?" Mrs. Tarrant hesitated before answering. "I don't recall. You might try. She described being dismissed by you last summer. That girl imagines slights the way other people imagine holidays." "Nevertheless, did she attend Heritage Day?" Mrs. Tarrant pursed her mouth. She appeared at the end, taking photographs of the plate. I asked her to stop. She said it was family. I said the church is family enough for anyone who behaves like one. Did anyone else speak to her? Councillor Hargreaves chatted her up because he chats up anything in a skirt. Miss Vole offered her a leaflet. And Mr. Cuffley. She knew where the side door was because she came in it on the day, claiming she didn't want to interrupt. Purbright wrote this down. When he looked up, Mrs. Tarrant was watching him. Well? Well, it helps. Thank you. I'll keep the chalice until our solicitor advises. You'll be informed. She stood, gathered her handbag, and left without farewell. Purbright sat back. Heritage Day, with its invited poking about, had given Eleanor access and the chance to measure her claim against the town's blunt present. But it had also given someone else a chance to watch her watching and to nurse a grievance of their own. Councillor Hargreaves chatting her up might have yielded names. Miss Vole's leaflet might have yielded a map. And a vicarage that filtered its post through Mrs. Gaskell might have yielded a missing letter. At 2:30, a constable knocked and entered with a small, awkward parcel. "Found on the vicarage step," he said. "Mrs. Gaskell says it wasn't there at lunch." The wrapping was brown paper, like puddicks, but tied with narrower string. Purbright opened it slowly. Inside lay a photograph and a second note. The photograph showed the chalice on a cloth, taken close enough to make the engraving plain. Beneath it, in slanted, confident handwriting, someone had written, "You've spoken. Now you'll regret it." Purbright felt the room go very still, as if Flaxborough had drawn breath again, but this time not for ceremony. Purbright held the note between finger and thumb as though it might smear. It was not block capitals this time, but a fluent, slightly theatrical hand, the sort that had practiced signing Christmas cards in a school office. The words were a near echo of the original threat, turned into an accusation. Whoever sent it wanted two things at once: to frighten Puddick into silence again, and to remind Purbright that his first move had been observed. "Where was this found?" he asked the constable. "On the vicarage step, sir. Tucked behind the flower pot. No one saw anyone leave it." "No one ever does," Purbright murmured. He placed the photograph and note in an evidence sleeve, then took his coat and hat. "Tell Sergeant Lovejoy to meet me at St. Barnabas, and ring Dr. Vickers. He can compare handwriting." Outside, the afternoon had turned bright in that washed-out way that makes everything look innocent even when it isn't. People on the square carried parcels and opinions. Children shouted in the schoolyard as if the day's biggest danger were a lost ball. Purbright drove to the vicarage first. Mrs. Gaskell answered, lips pressed thin with a sense of affront that someone might approach her door without an appointment. "Inspector." "Mrs. Gaskell, you said you didn't see anyone." "I saw no one. I went out to fetch the milk at 2. The step was clear. When I came in at 2:30, the parcel was there. If anyone had walked up this path, I'd have heard. These boards creak like judgment." Purbright glanced at the path. Gravel, not boards, and wide enough to make stealth difficult without being noticed by someone looking. But Mrs. Gaskell was a woman who listened for her own satisfaction, not other people's guilt. "Any callers today besides me and Reverend Puddick's parish folk?" "Only Mrs. Tarrant for lunch. She came to talk about your interference. She left just before 2. "Did she go to the front step?" "She went out the back. She always does. She says the front hall smells of sermons." Purbright let that sit. "You handle the vicar's post." "It is part of my duties." "Did you misplace a letter from Miss Scarrow last month?" Mrs. Gaskell's expression sharpened. "I misplaced nothing. I may have discarded a circular. One receives dozens. Girls selling conservatory insurance and prayer book charities. If she wrote without proper address or stamp, it could have been returned. She says she wrote properly. The young lady says many things." Mrs. Gaskell's tone was almost gentle now, which in her meant unkind. "She was never content. She came to the vicarage last summer asking for money for heritage restoration and left in a temper when we suggested she speak to the council. Did she smoke clove cigarettes? Yes. She filled the hall with the smell, like Christmas gone wrong. Purbright nodded. Eleanor had been here then, and Mrs. Gaskell remembered it not because it was notable, but because she disliked it. That could still be the sum of it. Yet the new note had been delivered after Purbright had already spoken to Eleanor, which made Eleanor the obvious scapegoat and therefore, in Flaxborough's mind, the likely culprit. Convenient for anyone who wanted the matter closed on a tidy, disreputable outsider. "Mrs. Gaskell," he said, "would you mind if we dusted your front step?" She sounded affronted at the possibility of dirt. "If you must, I've just scrubbed it." "Thank you." He stepped out and looked around. The step was open to view from the road if anyone glanced, but people rarely glanced unless something invited them. The flower pot at the side could conceal a hand for a second. The hedge by the lane could conceal a person for longer. Whoever delivered the parcel had chosen a time between 2 and 2:30. Mrs. Terence had left before 2. Milk collection at 2. Children out of school after 3. The window was narrow and domestic. Someone who knew Mrs. Gaskell's schedule or had watched it. Purbright drove to St. Barnabas. Lovejoy was already there with Cuffley and Miss Vole in the vestry, all three faces wearing the same worried politeness they might bring to a wedding suddenly cancelled. Puddock hovered by the altar, white-lipped. Purbright showed the note and photograph to the vicar first. Puddock's hand flew to his mouth. "Oh, my God! You spoke of it by calling me," Purbright said, not unkindly. "The writer wants you to believe that was a mistake. But how could they know? That is what we're finding out. Did anyone besides Mrs. Gaskell know about the note? I told no one. I barely dared tell you. And yet someone knew you had told me." Purbright turned to the others. "Cuffley, Miss Vole, did you see anyone around the vicarage this afternoon?" "Not I," Cuffley said quickly. Miss Vole hesitated. "I walked past on the way to the library. The curtains were drawn. I didn't see anyone, but Mrs. Terrence's car was parked in the lane a little longer than usual." "About what time?" "1:30. I remember because she nearly splashed me." Miss Vole paused, frowning slightly. "She was sitting in the car with someone. I assumed it was Councillor Hargreaves, but I didn't see his face." Lovejoy snorted. "Hargreaves sits in cars with anyone if he thinks it makes him look involved." Purbright noted it. "Did they notice you?" "I don't think so." Purbright thanked her and turned to Puddock. "Reverend, who took that photograph? Was it from Heritage Day?" Puddock leaned close. "No. That cloth is the one we keep in the safe. But the chalice was wrapped in it last night. I wrapped it myself. The photograph must have been taken before you took it away. Or," his voice trailed, "or someone had access to it at the vicarage last night," Purbright finished. Puddock looked faint. "No one came in. I locked the study." "People lock doors," Purbright said, "and still set parcels on desks. Some doors have older souls than locks." He glanced at the study window in his mind. Sash, easy to lift if you knew the catch, facing the small lane behind the vicarage. Not impossible. The photograph, too, could be a bluff. Something shot at another time to imply access now. But the cloth detail made bluff less likely unless the photographer knew the cloth existed. Lovejoy stepped closer. "So we're not done with Ellie Scarrow after all." Purbright shook his head slightly. "Not unless she can be in 2 places quietly at once. She agreed to come to the station this afternoon. She hasn't arrived yet." He checked his watch. "She's half an hour late." Puddock said, "Perhaps she's frightened." "Or perhaps she's being frightened." Purbright turned to Lovejoy. "Ring her cottage. If no answer, send a constable to check quietly. No sirens. No knocking like a taxman." Lovejoy relayed instructions. While he did, Purbright walked slowly up the aisle, letting his eyes drift over the pews, the hymn boards, the little ordinary things people leaned on without thinking. At the third pew, he stopped. A folded leaflet lay on the seat, not quite deliberately placed, not quite abandoned. He picked it up. It was a Heritage Day program, last year's, with a pencil circle around ecclesiastical silver display and a note in the margin. Ask about scarrow engraving. The handwriting was not Eleanor's. This was more angular, more hurried, the letters joined as if their owner wrote while someone was talking. Purbright turned it over and found another note on the back, written in the same hand. Lionel says, keep your head down. He's watching. Miss Vole, he said quietly. Who cleaned these pews last? She looked startled. I did yesterday, after the service. Did you notice that leaflet then? No, I'd have thrown it away. So it arrived after yesterday. He folded it carefully. A small thing, but a live one. Someone had been here recently with Heritage Day on their mind and the scarrow engraving as a question rather than a claim. Someone who thought Lionel watched them. Lionel Tuke, choir master, theatre thwarted by buses, a man who collected slights as rigorously as hymnals. Lovejoy returned from the phone in the vestry doorway. His face was redder than usual. Cottage is empty, sir. Neighbor says she went out at 2 with a handbag. She hasn't come back. Purbright's mind settled into the next shape of trouble. A late arrival could be petulance. An empty cottage after a new threat could be something else entirely. Right, he said gently to the vicar and the 2 parish helpers. I'll find her. Reverend, you go home and keep your doors locked. Miss Vole, if you remember anything else, anything even trivial about Heritage Day or the choir, write it down for me. Cuffly, don't polish anything I haven't seen. There may be more paper about than you think. He stepped out into the clean afternoon, knowing full well that it had just become, in Flaxborough terms, decidedly unclean. Purbright drove first to the Vale cottages, because absence is a sort of address. The lane was quiet, a dog that regarded him with suspicion, and Mrs. Rook's net curtains twitching in their usual manner. Cottage 3 sat shut and neat, the path empty except for the damp imprint of a boot heel in the gravel at the gate. He knocked softly, then harder. No answer. The door was locked. Nothing looked disturbed, which was either reassuring or a sign of a neat mind at work. Mrs. Rook opened her door before he reached it. She was tall and angular, hair pinned in a style that had once been fashionable and now was merely determined. Inspector, about Eleanor. Yes. You saw her leave at 2. I saw her stride off, yes. Like she was late to be offended. Direction. Toward the square. She had a brown handbag. Not the one she came home with. She's got new things all at once, hasn't she? Did anyone come to see her before she left? A man. Stood at her door around 1:30. Parked where my grandson parks. Blue car. I couldn't see his face, but he wore a raincoat, though it wasn't raining. Did he go inside? Yes. For 10 minutes. Then he left and she left later. Do you know any men with blue cars and unnecessary raincoats? Half the council, she said with relish. Especially Hargreaves. He thinks a coat makes him official. Purbright thanked her and returned to his car. If Councillor Hargreaves had visited Eleanor after her interview, he had done so before the new threat arrived at the vicarage. That didn't clear him. It put him in the right corridor of time. And if a second person had been in a car with Mrs. Terence, the council were already orbiting the matter like moths. He drove toward the square, looking for anything that didn't belong on an ordinary Wednesday. The market was thinning. Austin's had its door propped open with a crate. Ordinary life ran on, but Purbright felt its gears beginning to catch. In the square he stopped at the cafe, partly because Eleanor had no car and a missing woman tends to reappear where tea is served. The owner, Mrs. Hatch, had a memory like a till. Yes, she was in, Mrs. Hatch said at once. Came about 2:10. Sat by the window, didn't have any cake, just coffee, black. She was waiting for someone. Who? A man. He came in 5 minutes later. Dark suit, silky voice, not one of ours. Looked like he'd been taught to lift his feet when he walked. He sat with her, talked low. She looked angry, then tired. Then she left with him. Did she seem unwilling? Mrs. Hatch considered. She looked the way a woman looks when she thinks she shouldn't go and does anyway. There was a lot of smiling that didn't reach the eyes. Did you hear a name? Only him saying Lionel once. But it sounded like a warning. Purbright felt the smallest internal shift. Lionel again. Not Tuke necessarily, but the leaflet in the pew had been explicit about a Lionel watching. Which direction did they go? Toward the station, down Post Office Lane. Purbright left, crossed the square to Post Office Lane and followed it toward the tracks. At the corner by the old co-op, he met Sergeant Lovejoy approaching with a look of resigned irritation. "Been to the cottages?" Lovejoy asked. "Yes." She was seen leaving with a man toward the station. Blue car, raincoat earlier, dark suit later. Any sightings your end? Only Hargreaves wandering about asking if he could assist. I told him to assist at home. "Let's see the station," Purbright said. At the forecourt, a porter was stacking parcels. Purbright asked if anyone had seen a woman matching Eleanor's description. The porter scratched his head. "She were here, about 3:30, with a gent in a suit. He bought tickets to Norwich. She didn't speak, just stood there holding her bag. They got the 3:42. I remember because she dropped her glove and didn't pick it up." "He did." "Norwich," Lovejoy repeated. "Ring Norwich Station. Ask if they got off there. Meanwhile, find me Mr. Lionel Tuke." Quietly. Lovejoy nodded and went to the phone. Purbright stooped and picked up the glove from the forecourt bench where the porter had placed it. Pale leather, size small, and inside it was a stiff rectangle. A folded note, torn from a program, written in that same angular joined hand as the leaflet. "If anything happens to me, it's not Eleanor. It's him. L.T." He looked at the stitching on the glove and saw a tiny smear of theatre grease paint along the cuff, the sort Mr. Tuke dabbed on for amateur productions. It was not proof, only a scent. Still, Purbright felt the town's polite surface ripple, as if someone backstage had moved a prop quietly. Purbright stared at the initials. L.T. could be Lionel Tuke. It could be Lionel anything, but in Flaxborough, coincidences came in chains. The porter had not seen who left the glove. Perhaps Eleanor had dropped it, and the man in the suit had returned it with a message. Perhaps someone else had planted it. Either way, it had been left where a policeman might find it. Lovejoy returned. "Norwich says woman and gent got off at Walsingham Cross, sir. That's 6 miles up. Taxi rank there." Purbright pocketed the glove. "Good. Get a car there. Check the taxis. I'm going to see Tuke." They drove back toward town. Purbright felt the case turning from ownership quarrel into something less tidy. Eleanor had wanted the chalice, but now she was moving under someone else's direction, and someone with a voice that could make her smile unwillingly. If L.T. had slipped that warning, he was afraid enough to leave a trail in public. And fear in Flaxborough was a loud thing indeed. Purbright found Lionel Tuke not in the church where he might have been expected, but behind the parish hall, smoking under the eaves as if the building itself had asked him for secrecy. He had the defensive poise of a man forever anticipating criticism and never quite believing praise. When he saw the inspector, he flicked ash too sharply. "Inspector, I suppose this is about last night's nonsense." "We'll talk about nonsense in a moment," Purbright said. "First, where is Eleanor Scarrow?" Tuke's face emptied and then refilled in smaller pieces. "How should I know?" "Because her last known companion mentioned Lionel as a warning," Purbright replied mildly. "And because a note with your initials has turned up in her glove." Tuke opened his mouth and shut it. Whatever theatrical retort he had prepared did not quite fit the line. "That glove wasn't hers," he said at last. "Oh? It was mine. I lent it to her." He saw Purbright's raised eyebrow and rushed on. "For the station. Her hands were cold. She'd left in a hurry. You do lend gloves, Inspector. You may not know, being a man. You lent her a glove and slipped a note in it about yourself." Tuke stared at the cigarette as if it had betrayed him. "I didn't slip anything. The note wasn't mine." He drew in a breath. "Look, I've had my disagreements with Eleanor, but I didn't make her vanish. I tried to stop her doing something foolish, that's all. Tell me from the beginning as if you want to be believed." Tuke let out a sharp laugh, then softened. "Fine. Heritage Day. She came in, all London angles and old grievances. Mrs. Terence was playing museum mummy, and Ellie got into it with her about the chalice. I heard the whole thing. She was right in spirit, but spirit doesn't win in Flaxborough. It just gets you called dramatic. You spoke to her after." "I did. I wanted to calm her down. She was in bits." He paused, and the dry wit fled his face for something older. "I liked her once, you know. We were teenagers. She sang in the choir for a term and made me feel my life wasn't entirely a local production. Then she married that rook lout and went away. When she turned up last summer, she came to me first, not the vicar. Maybe because she knew the vicar would listen and apologize. I'd listen and do something. What did she ask you?" "To help her get the chalice back. Properly, through papers. I told her the letters might help, but she'd need patience. She said she was done with patience. I said Flaxborough survives on patience and small cruelties. She said she'd rather survive without them." He watched the smoke curl. "Then she began asking sideways about the safe, about who had keys. I told her. I didn't see harm in facts. We talked about it again last week. I said if she stole it, the town would crucify her for the theft and ignore the reason. She laughed at that too. And yesterday? Yesterday she came to see me before you did. She'd heard you were asking questions. She said—" He swallowed. "She said someone had approached her. A man. Said he could sort the chalice business if she'd meet him for lunch and listen. She said she didn't trust him. I told her not to go. She said she wanted to see what game he was playing." His hands twitched. "After you left her cottage, she rang me. She sounded shaken, said the chalice part was over, but the man was not. She said he knew too much. I asked who. She said, 'Lionel, it's Councillor Hargreaves.'" Purbright let his silence stay long enough for its shape to be felt. "Hargreaves," Lovejoy muttered beside him. Tuke nodded miserably. He was at Heritage Day, of course. He was interested in her. More interested than she was willing to entertain. She rebuffed him, publicly. It bruised him. "Yet not enough to keep away," Purbright said. "No, he's the sort who thinks a rebuff is a cue for extra charm. He followed her out that day. I saw them talking by the churchyard gate. He kept smiling the way men do when they're sure a woman will eventually be grateful for their persistence. She didn't smile back. And he approached her last summer as well." "He did. He likes clever women right up until they remind him he's not the cleverest man in the room." Purbright nodded. It was the first obvious suspect the town would reach for, and therefore one he had quietly postponed. Hargreaves had motive enough to want control of the narrative, knowledge enough to understand the safe and the side door, and vanity enough to think he could stage a little drama to win a woman, or punish her for refusing to play along. "Where did she say she was meeting him?" Purbright asked. "Walsingham Cross. He said he'd show her the original Scarrow correspondence he claimed to have found in council archives. She said it sounded like a trap. I agreed. She went anyway." Purbright turned to Lovejoy. "You heard. Take a car to Walsingham Cross. Quiet. Check the taxis and the inns. If she's there, bring her in gently. If she isn't, bring in Hargreaves." Lovejoy was already moving. Purbright stayed with Tuke a moment. You may have saved her by telling me this now. Tuke's laugh was brittle. Or damned her if he finds out I spoke. Hargreaves does not frighten me, Purbright said. But you should lock your back door tonight. People who rely on reputation are dangerous when it slips. They returned to the station. Purbright had scarcely taken his coat off when Lovejoy rang in. We've got her, Lovejoy said, shaken but whole. She was at the River Swan out by the cross. The landlord says Hargreaves brought her in, sweet as syrup, then they argued. He left angry. She stayed in the back parlour and wouldn't use the phone. We're bringing her now, and we've a unit outside Hargreaves' house. Good. Eleanor arrived 10 minutes later, face pale, hair disordered by wind and indecision. She looked relieved to see Purbright and embarrassed to be relieved. Inspector, she began. Sit down, he said gently. Tell me what happened, as if you want to be safe. Her eyes flashed at the phrasing, then softened. He came to my cottage at 1:30. I didn't ask him in, but he walked in anyway and started talking as if we were old friends. He said the police were misunderstanding me because I'd embarrassed the town. He said he could smooth it if I agreed to let him handle the church council. Then he said something worse, that the letters I showed you weren't the only ones, that my great-uncle's agreement had a clause about moral conduct of heirs. He said it meant the chalice wouldn't be returned to a fallen woman. Her jaw tightened. I asked what he meant by fallen. He smiled and said the town had a long memory about my divorce. So he threatened you with gossip dressed up as law? Yes. And then he said he knew I'd tried to take the chalice last night. He said he'd tell the Gazette unless I did what he asked, which was to come with him and sign a statement admitting the attempted theft and relinquishing any claim to the chalice. In exchange, he'd keep it quiet and help me settle into town. Her mouth twisted. I told him to go to hell. He said I was already halfway there. Purbright listened without interruption, letting the rhythm of her anger show its own proof. And the second note at the vicarage? He asked. Her eyes widened. What second note? The one that said, "You've spoken, now you'll regret it." She stared. I never went near the vicarage after yesterday morning. I went to the cafe because Hargreaves told me to meet him there. I thought he might be bluffing. I wanted to hear his terms in public. He said, Walsingham Cross. I went because... She gave a helpless, bitter shrug. Because I was sick of being cornered. Purbright nodded. You were meant to be cornered. Hargreaves needed you to look like a criminal again after you'd agreed to cooperate, so he could step in as the town's tidy solution. Eleanor's breath caught. He wrote the first note too. He had access. He watched Reverend Puddick's anxiety from council meetings and saw an opening. He likely heard your argument on Heritage Day and decided to leverage it. He found Ma through the pub, used your name to bait him, and used Thomas Spendlove to keep his own hands clean. When Reverend Puddick called me, Hargreaves needed to tighten the threat. He photographed the chalice when you weren't looking last night, perhaps by borrowing a key under civic duty or simply by slipping into the vicarage garden while everyone was at tea. Then he left the photograph and the second note to make you the obvious culprit. If I arrested you, the town would nod approvingly, and he would be the man who helped restore order. Eleanor stared, half fury, half exhaustion. All to keep me quiet. All to keep himself important, Purbright said. Important men fear being laughed at more than they fear the law. Lovejoy came in, hat askew, eyes bright with satisfaction. We've got Hargreaves downstairs. He's demanding to speak to the chief constable, the bishop, and the BBC. Shall I let him warm your chair? Please do. Hargreaves entered with a damp overcoat and the swagger of a man rehearsed in indignation. He stopped when he saw Eleanor sitting there. For a fraction of a second, his face tightened in something close to panic. Then he pushed a smile forward. Eleanor, delighted you're safe. Inspector, I've been assisting with all this, and I must say the town is quite appalled by the way. Purbright held up a hand. Not rude, merely final. Councillor, sit down. Hargreaves did so, slowly. "Last night you were seen at the station before 9, Purbright said. "You told Sergeant Lovejoy you'd heard shouting. There was no shouting until the police arrived. So, you were there because you expected an event. I was there because I'd been told." "By whom?" Hargreaves' mouth opened, closed. "By someone concerned. Someone concerned enough to smell of clove cigarettes and wear a green-stoned ring?" His eyes flicked to Eleanor's hand before he caught himself. "That's absurd. You visited Miss Scarrow at 1:30 yesterday, and again met her at the cafe. Multiple witnesses. You persuaded her to go to Walsingham Cross. You threatened to use her attempt to reclaim the chalice to ruin her reputation, and you manufactured a second threat to reinforce that pressure." Purbright placed the leaflet from the pew on the desk. "You left this in church after you spoke to her on Heritage Day. Your handwriting matches the back note. Dr. Vickers confirms the same hand wrote the 'regret it' message." Hargreaves stared at the paper as if wishing it were a sermon he could argue with. "I don't know what you're talking about. I've done nothing but try to preserve civic dignity." "Your dignity, yes. Civic, no." Purbright leaned forward slightly. "You assumed the vicar would be too frightened to call police. When he did, you tried to close the matter by pushing Miss Scarrow into a confession. You did not intend to take the chalice for yourself. You intended to keep your leverage and her silence. That is blackmail, Counselor, and conspiracy to steal." Hargreaves flushed. "She's twisting this. She's always been volatile. You can't take her word. I'm not." Purbright's voice stayed gentle. "I'm taking Ma's word, Spendlove's word, Mrs. Hatch's word, Miss Vole's word, and your own neat habit of placing yourself where drama might occur. The town will not be saved by men who treat it like a stage." For a moment, Hargreaves looked as though he might explode into a speech. Then the realization arrived that this was not a council meeting where his voice could fill the room by right. He sagged, smaller in his chair. "I only wanted her to behave," he muttered. "People who say that," Purbright replied, "usually mean behave as I wish." Lovejoy rose behind him. "Come on then, Counselor. We'll get your particulars." Hargreaves went out without looking at Eleanor. When the door shut, Eleanor let her breath go in a long, shaky line. "So what happens to the chalice?" "It stays with the church for now," Purbright said, "but not in silence. Those letters will be considered properly, and Reverend Puddick will answer his post in future." She almost smiled. "You make it sound easy." "I make it sound bearable. There's a difference." She stood. "Thank you, Inspector." "Thank me by not hiring boys at railway boxes again." Her laugh this time reached her eyes. She left with Lovejoy to sign her statement as witness rather than accused. By evening, Flaxborough began its second service, the one conducted in kitchens and shop doorways. There would be shock and there would be satisfaction, because the guilty party was tidy at last. A counsellor with a known appetite for self-importance. Mrs. Terence would be furious at first and relieved later. Mrs. Gaskell would claim she had always thought Hargreaves a menace to morality. The Gazette would run a headline about chalice plot foiled that made it sound like a pantomime, and the town would read it with the same polite indignation it always saved for itself. 2 days later, in a calm meeting at the vicarage, Purbright sat with Puddick, Mrs. Terence, a diocesan solicitor, and Eleanor. He spoke very little. The solicitor spoke a great deal. The eventual arrangement was simple. If not swift, the chalice would remain parish property while still used, but on Eleanor's death, provided she stayed within the Scarrow line's intent, it would pass to her nominated heir or to a small family trust. The church would also resume using the chalice for significant services, not as a museum piece, but as a living memorial to Margaret Scarrow. It was not everything Eleanor wanted. It was enough to make her breathe. In the weeks after, Hargreaves resigned in a blaze of injured letters and found himself suddenly short of audiences. Lionel Tuke stopped smoking under eaves and began rehearsing the choir with a quieter temper. Tom Spendlove kept time better. Miss Vole, when passing the vicarage, noticed the curtains open more often than before, and Reverend Puddick, chastened and mildly grateful, learned that politeness was safer with truth than with fear. Purbright returned to his desk, filled in forms in neat ink, and allowed himself one private reflection, that Flaxborough's gravest disruptions were rarely loud. They were made instead of whispers, of pride, of the dangerous thought that other people's lives were useful props. Then he filed the last paper, adjusted his spectacles, and looked out at the square as it resumed being itself, ordinary, alert, and a touch more honest than it had been the week before.